Welcome to Math GPT. Today we'll learn how to write the net ionic equation for the reaction between sodium carbonate and copper sulfate. Let's start with our balanced molecular equation. The reaction between sodium carbonate and copper sulfate produces sodium sulfate and copper carbonate. This equation is already balanced with one of each reactant and product. Next, we need to identify which compounds are soluble and insoluble in water. Sodium carbonate and copper sulfate are both soluble salts. Sodium sulfate is also soluble. However, copper carbonate is insoluble and will form a precipitate. Now let's write the complete ionic equation by breaking down the soluble compounds into their ions. Sodium carbonate breaks into 2 sodium ions and 1 carbonate ion. Copper sulfate breaks into 1 copper 2 plus ion and 1 sulfate ion. Sodium sulfate breaks into 2 sodium ions and 1 sulfate ion. Copper carbonate stays together as it's insoluble. Let's identify the spectator ions. These are ions that appear unchanged on both sides of the equation. The sodium ions appear as 2 Na plus on both sides. The sulfate ion SO4 2- also appears unchanged on both sides. These are our spectator ions and can be eliminated. After removing the spectator ions, we're left with our net ionic equation. The carbonate ion from sodium carbonate reacts with the copper 2 plus ion from copper sulfate to form insoluble copper carbonate. This is our net ionic equation. Let's summarize what we've learned. To write a net ionic equation, first, write the balanced molecular equation. Then identify soluble and insoluble compounds. Write the complete ionic equation by breaking down soluble compounds into their ions. Identify and remove spectator ions. What remains is your net ionic equation, showing only the ions that actually participate in the reaction.